We're live. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the Valley Votes Confidently event. We have with us tonight Judd Choate, from the Director of Elections from the state of Colorado. He had a previous life as an academic working in political science, but has since joined the application side of elections. And he'll give us a little bit more information about his background and work. He did a really fantastic and interesting poll in 2020 about trust in elections, and he's going to share with us some of the information that he received from that, and then tell us about how it applies to our state of Virginia. And again, the purpose of the Valley Votes Project is to engage our community in order to encourage voter registration, voter education, and hopefully voting on election day, which is November 8th. Polls are open in the state of Virginia from 6 a.m. until 7 p.m. We still have an open registration period until October 17th is the last day to register to vote. And the last day to request an absentee ballot in the state of Virginia is October 25th. So just to keep those dates in mind. Thank you so much for joining us today. Judd, I will just make it's all full screen. We're all ready to go.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. I appreciate it. It's great to be with you. All right, you ready for me? Thumbs up. All right. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. Bobby is doing some great work with the Strategic Scholars program that we've been working with, and so I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to you. A little bit about my background. I'm the state election director for Colorado. I've been the state election director for 13 years now. Before that, I was an attorney at a law firm, and my job was to sue the Secretary of State's office. So I think that the only reason they hired me was to, keep me from suing them, remove one problem that they had by bringing that person in-house. I also clerked at the Colorado Supreme Court for 2 years, and I was a clerk for the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge Timkovich. And before that, I was an academic. So I was a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska, taught campaigns and elections and methods. So that's my background. It's great to be here, and excited to tell you a little bit about what we did in 2020. What we decided to do, not really knowing that the 2020 election would be so disputed or sort of fraught with various claims of fraud. We just planned to do a major post-election survey anyway, just to better understand our voters and how our voters were reacting to certain policy changes we had made, and some policy rollouts, some different programs we were trying. And we felt like doing a survey would give us some real insight into that. So we had budgeted that and worked with a survey agency, a nonprofit that does surveys for governments, and we all had that all queued up. And then when the election happened, and we very quickly saw that we had a new and different problem than we anticipated, we shifted a bit and added a bunch of new questions, and decided to run a qualitative version of that survey to sort of test out our questions, test out what we were trying to accomplish, seeing if we were getting the kinds of answers that we wanted. We added that qualitative, which really sort of mapped out how we would ask those questions in our quantitative. So it expanded our survey process quite substantially. And in doing so, I think improved the survey a lot and gave us some real insight into how the mis and disinformation of the 2020 election were that all of that conversation, how that conversation was either how it was affecting people's perception or whether the things we were doing were mitigating mis and disinformation in some ways. So we did that survey, those two surveys, the qualitative and the quantitative. And so let me show you a little bit about that. So I'm going to put this on the screen if I can, but you have disabled my ability to do that. Very sly of you, which will make it very difficult for me to do my presentation. All right, let me try now. There we go. Let's see here. Curious. Hold on, let me see if I can find it. It's not coming up. So I will close some of these other things. Now let's go. There it is. Okay. Now it should work. Okay, I assume all of you can see that. Tell me if you can't. If I hear nothing, I will assume everything's good. So this was our post-2020 voter surveys. And then I talked a little bit about the outreach campaign that we did that was related to this. So it was a two-step process. We did a quantitative and a qualitative, started with qualitative, and then we did a quantitative survey. And then we did the outreach based on the findings. Here's some of the survey background. The qualitative survey was 83 participants, 82 of whom were registered voters. And then we did a quantitative survey of about 1,000 respondents. The first one was done in March of 2021. The second one was done in May of 2021. So this was a lot of what we were doing in those couple of months after the election and into the new year. We were working on these various surveys. By the way, just to give you a heads up, there's like 65 slides in this presentation, which is way too many. So I'm going to fly through some of these. If you have any questions about them, I can always go back and I can provide a copy of the presentation if you really want to dive into some of these. So here's the qualitative survey. So we spoke to 83 people. We asked about a whole bunch of different things. They had to sort of fit some criteria. That's an example of the demographics of that group that we spoke to. Overall, the respondents were very positive about the voting process and their experience voting in Colorado. Most of the respondents felt like it was easy or very easy to vote in Colorado, and generally had very positive things to say about that. So here are some of those quotes. You don't need to read all those. Here are some numbers. So both Democrats and Republicans really shared their positive views of how the voting process works in Colorado. Most people found information easily and found that information to be helpful. Nearly 3 in 4 had a lot of trust in the information that they found. Trust was a little higher with men and with liberals. It's an odd combination, which you'll see later in the quantitative. That doesn't usually go. Men and liberals don't tend to correspond in their agreement on issues. About a third of the participants did have interactions with elections officials, and you can see that most of them tended to be more liberal, female, and Hispanic. Those who were less likely to have an interaction were conservative and male. That's usually the corresponding relationship. Here again, some more notes from folks about what they did and what their conversations were with election officials. That's specifically about drop boxes. So while respondents were confident in the integrity and security of the elections, they did have some diverging perceptions on some various issues. And so I'll kind of walk you through some of those. Pretty much everybody considered the election secure, with about 2 out of 3 saying it was very secure. This was weighted to the Democratic side, but Republicans also felt this way. We got some great comments on these. People seem to really like the way that we run our elections and had a lot to say that was very positive about it. 2 out of 3 were highly confident that their ballot was received and counted accurately. Again, we're weighted on the Democratic side, but still getting very good response rate, positive response rates from Republican and unaffiliated. Just so that you know the landscape of voters in Colorado, about 30% of our electorate is Democrat, about 30% of our electorate is Republican, and then around 40% of our electorate is unaffiliated. So unaffiliated is our largest group. Sometimes people refer to them as independents. Technically in Colorado, they're unaffiliated. So here was some comments that we received about the overall election process, positives and negatives. More than half of our participants were able to track their ballots online. So that's 57%. And people seem to be very positive about that. And I'll actually have a slide coming up that really breaks that down. The interesting thing about this, which is always sort of funny, is that we have only 52% of our electorate that signed up for ballot tracking. So I'm not really sure where that extra 5% was seeing their ballots. You can always, when you do these post-election surveys and your like overall state turnout was 70%, then you'll have 80% say that they voted. There's always that little funky data point. Most respondents say that the ability to track ballots really boosted their confidence. So some were greatly increased, some saw increase to some extent. And then you can see about 30% felt like it was no impact or even a slightly decreased confidence. This was a really big deal for us. First of all, this was a huge rollout. It was a lot of work. We spent weeks and weeks working on how we would message, under what circumstances, at what point in the election cycle, and then making the decision, which we ultimately did, to enroll everybody that we had enough information to enroll. So we didn't ask people if they wanted to receive notices about their ballots. We just did it. And we did it for every person that had an email address on file in their voter registration database. So that meant that we were, before the election, at about 44%, because that's what percentage of our electorate had an email address on file. And then after the election, by the time the election had completed, we were at about 52%. So 52% of our electorate now receives actually, that's not true. Now it's about 57%. But back then it was about 52% receive information tracking their ballots. Again, some comments. Several respondents did mention that local election information was not something that was focused in a lot of these conversations, which it's really sort of the slow decline of local news was really affecting people's confidence in local kinds of questions. As you can see, most of the respondents had confidence in election results, and that also broke very nicely across the two parties. Then we break into some other areas. Now we're sort of shifting to the way people see national numbers. So there was a drop in confidence when you added in nationwide results. So you can see here on this page where the confidence in election results, Colorado versus nationwide, pretty much everybody, if you look at those green columns, pretty much everybody was in the confident or somewhat confident categories related to Colorado's numbers. But then when you shifted to national, we started to lose that. And of course, when you ask that question and you're only asking it of folks that have a more conservative perspective, that number really falls apart. So that's where we're sort of tapping into that mis and disinformation about election outcomes. Here was some of the comments that we had there. We had a number of respondents that did believe that fraud was a significant issue. And as you can see that if you break it into subgroups, if you're 40 plus, you're more likely than younger voters. If you are female versus male, at least in this survey, it kind of changes in the larger quantitative survey. And then if you're white, you're more likely to believe that there were problems in the election. And if you're registered Republican, you're a lot more likely. So that's something that we see through the quantitative data as well. I'm going to skip some of the stories about news because I think we all sort of understand the problem of news. So let me go to this next one. Okay. Now we're back to sort of voter fraud questions. So what we're asking people is various types of fraud and the percentage of those who are worried about fraud in these various categories. The first one is non-citizens or non-eligible individuals becoming registered to vote. That was the highest category among our qualitative folks. Then allowing individuals to return up to 10 ballots on behalf of other people. So Colorado is a mail ballot state, so a lot of ballots are transported from the voter back to either a polling place or to a drop box by people who are not the voter. And so we have some leeway in our law for that. But when you ask about it, that received a lot of unfavorable response. Colorado is also a Dominion state. I believe Virginia is also a Dominion state, but we're a Dominion software state, which is the equipment that we use for casting and scanning ballots. In Colorado, we actually have 2 counties that are clear ballots counties, but then we have 64 that are Dominion. So we're basically a Dominion state. And so that was something that people really tapped into, both for in-person voting and then for the scanning. Some folks didn't like sending ballots to every registered voter or active registered voter, and then the use of drop boxes. Majority felt like none of these were problems. Many of them tapped into multiple of these issues. And then on the, we had some sort of quotes from the 2 ends of the spectrum. Interestingly, perhaps unsurprisingly, the conservative narratives are more on the integrity side, and the liberal narratives are much more on the process side. All right, so let's jump to the quantitative survey, because I think you'll probably get a little bit more out of this, but I did want to sort of touch on the qualitative. So we had 1,010 respondents. There's the breakdown of the various demographics of those folks. It's pretty much matches our state. The gender is almost perfect. The ideology, as we understand it, is almost perfect. The age is really close. The party identification is a little off because we should have a higher unaffiliated, lower Democrat, but pretty close. And this is a slightly whiter group of respondents than we see in our population. Colorado's population is almost 40% minority. So we have a very large Hispanic population at nearly 30%. So we're underrepresented with Hispanics, and then generally speaking, we're overrepresented with whites. But the rest of it's pretty close, and so we felt pretty good about it. And by then we had added so many numbers, and the cost was getting big enough that we just sort of dropped it at 1,000. Some of the conclusions. So the good. So I'm going to have a couple of slides here. There's the good, the bad. I didn't do an ugly slide for you Lee Van Cleef fans, but we have a good and a bad set of results from this. The first is that Coloradans seem to find voting easy and accessible. They trust our department, so the Department of State, and the counties that run the free and fair elections. They feel like they benefit from elections information, and that Coloradans have more confidence in their state and local elections than in national elections. So a lot of the same ideas that we talked about in the qualitative, not unsurprisingly. I mean, that's sort of why you do the qualitative, so you tee up the quantitative issues. When we asked the question in 2020, was it easy to vote? 81% said it was easy, 17% said it was somewhat easy. That's a lot of people. So 97% felt like it was easy or somewhat easy. How committed would you say that each of the following is to make sure that US elections are fair and accurate? When you think of elections officials, most voters think of local elections officials. And so local elections officials in the Colorado Secretary of State's office did very well. And then it sort of trailed off from there, the lowest being the former president. And you'll kind of see the theme of that, but we'll break it down by party here in a moment. So how committed would you say that each of the following are to make sure that elections in the US are accurate and fair? So now when we're asking these questions, we're asking them by party. So local officials and the Colorado Secretary of State's office still getting very good marks across both Democrats and Republicans, as well as unaffiliated. But we can see the real demarcation between Democrats and Republicans. But then if you go down to like President Biden or former President Trump, you can see those numbers invert. And you can really see the attitudes are based on who instead of what. They're not based on process or policy, they're based on people. And so that really taps into that question of legitimacy, and sort of cult of personality issue that I think pervades our political thinking right now. This one was, how would you describe voter information that was provided to you by organizations ahead of the 2020 election? If it's the Secretary of State's office, that's the light blue, and local government, you can see that pretty much people really like that. But then when you get into sort of political information, people get annoyed, confused, they feel like it's repetitive or frustrating or biased. So unsurprisingly, SMEs, subject matter experts, are the folks that are going to get the best response about the information they provide to voters. And then we ask a couple of different questions. So this is one of those tables that takes into account a couple of different things. It's how secure did you feel the election was from foreign interference? How secure did you feel like Colorado's election was from foreign interference? And then across the nation, how did you feel like the 2020 election was? So it was local, state, and then national. And local and state, again, we're in pretty good shape. But once we get into the national side, that's when people start to trail off. Still okay, but we're starting to lose people. Okay, so the bad. Respondents do have confidence in Colorado elections, but all groups have less confidence in the security integrity in national elections. People consume a lot of social media, even though they readily admit, and there's this great slide I've got here, that they don't trust it. They don't trust social media, but they consume a lot of it. And then roughly 40% of respondents believe that fraud significantly contributed to the national outcome in 2020. That's a really high number, and sort of a frightening number for the future of a democracy. And then concern about voter fraud narratives varies significantly from people who believe there's no fraud to people who believe that, I'm bought and sold by George Soros. So let's go through some of these. Again, this is a multiple question one where we're sort of tapping into this idea of local, statewide, and national. So confidence that people have. Liberal respondents, generally speaking, were confident about all three of those elections, local, state, and national. Moderates, less so, but still confident. And then you got into conservatives more on the state level, but far less on the national level. Trend line that I'm sure doesn't surprise you, and you'll see throughout a lot of the questions. Here's that note about social media. So you can see that those people consume a lot of this. So the but they don't have a lot of confidence in it. There's not a ton of confidence in on the X part of the axis, and then on the Y axis, you can see that they do a lot of consuming of that type of information. Nearly 40% of Coloradans believe that there was voter fraud. So you can see like who among us believed that there was voter fraud in the Colorado election based on party affiliation. Almost 70% of Republicans felt that way, 65% of conservatives. And then Colorado has this weird dynamic where we have what we call the Front Range, and then we have all of the other parts of the state, which are the outside of the Front Range. And outside of the Front Range is about a third of our electorate. Most of our population in Colorado lives in the Front Range. So that's like Denver up to Fort Collins, down to Pueblo, with Colorado Springs in between. So those are the big cities that kind of line the edge of the mountains as you are going east to west. And you can see that outside of the Front Range, so in the more rural parts of the state, they were far less confident. And then if they voted in person, they were less confident. So if you vote by mail and you trusted your mail ballot, you trusted the drop box and all that stuff, you're going to be less concerned about that. So let's break it down. These are the really sort of fun slides. I'll spend a little bit more time on this one because this is where you can actually look deep into the fraud that people believe. So the question is, please indicate how often you think that these activities occurred in your county or city. So now we're talking about local elections. And these, the categories are people voting more than once, people stealing or tampering ballots, people pretending to be someone they're not, people voting who are not US citizens, people voting an absentee ballot intended for a different person, officials changing the reported vote count, vote counting software manipulated in a way to not count ballots as intended, paying voters to cast a ballot for a particular candidate. That's a big thing in mail ballot that people worry about. Voting under fraudulent voter registrations that use a phony name or a fake address, and people submitting too many ballots in drop boxes on behalf of voters. Democrats generally thought that this was happening at a pretty low percentage, in the 20s. Unaffiliated, that number goes up into the high 20s, maybe into the 30s. And then Republicans saw this in the, say, 40s to 50s. The one that really stands out in this, to me at least, is the non-US citizen voting. I just will tell you that in Colorado, as in most states, that's a ridiculous claim, because we know when somebody registers to vote whether they're a citizen or not, because it's in our database of people who are issued driver's licenses, and most people who are issued driver's licenses are the people who will end up voting using that as an ID. So, but it's an issue that people have. So now let's look at nationwide. So now the question is, please indicate how often you believe these activities occurred throughout the country. Our Democratic numbers go up a little bit. They go, let's say 5% or so from earlier. Unaffiliated, yep, we've gone up again, maybe 5 to maybe 10%. And then now those Republican numbers have really risen. We're in the 60s and 70s across the board on these. The non-US citizen issue has basically washed away. That's no longer the leading indicator. They all are running about the same. They're all in the 60s or 70s among our Republican respondents. And you can tell that really there's a lot of doubt about what's happening in other states and the way other states are conducting their election. No offense to Virginia, but they're very worried about you, our respondents to this survey. So that created some messaging opportunities for us. And those were things like low level of knowledge about key elements of elections. Knowledge can increase confidence. If you sort of add things like, say, ballot tracking, and the fact that everything happens in a bipartisan way, you can really increase trust. So we did things like we asked the question, if you knew this, which of these would improve your confidence in elections? And so we gave them a bunch of things that we do. So we test the equipment, we do everything bipartisan, we conduct audits, everything is in paper ballots, we work with law enforcement to prosecute voter fraud, and so forth and so on. So, and all of those things had a positive effect. Many of them had a pretty substantial positive effect. So that, of course, tap into this idea of what can we do to improve what people think about our elections. If we ask the question, how does knowing that Colorado does these following things affect your level of confidence? You can see that it has a very positive effect. So this was important in the way that we sort of framed our post-election messaging. We asked, where do you get information about the voting process? And we're sort of now trying to understand information outlets and how we can get that information to voters. The easiest way is to put something in the ballot packet, because that's where almost 50% of our voters were learning about how the election is conducted and what they should do in an election. And then it kind of goes down from there. Social media is always that worrisome one, because who knows what you'll learn in social media. And then what of the social media platforms do you use most? Well, it's Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. That's where we sort of focused to try to build some confidence by tapping into those platforms and trying to sell our messaging. I would note, just as a passing aside, that Facebook is continuing its deeply failed policy from the 2020 election of considering county and state election officials to be the same as political candidates. And so there is a blackout period that Facebook will not allow SMEs like me, those that actually know the truth about elections. There's a blackout period for us to buy ads on Facebook. So we can't buy an ad on Facebook now, and we won't be able to buy an ad on Facebook through December and into early January, because apparently I am a politician. So let me talk to you a little bit about what we did with our outreach. So there's our objectives and why. We did this fun little catchy campaign where we did opinions are fun, but facts are better. There's a couple of little fun ones there. Flip-flops are all season footwear. That's not true in Colorado. And I-70 traffic, that's the traffic from Denver into the mountains, is my favorite wintertime activity. It's not, it sucks. We did our 3-point plan. We had an amplification network, which was really pushing our messaging. We had 1,000 different either government offices, unions, chambers of commerce, religious organizations, sports teams. We got the Denver Nuggets, the Colorado Rockies, and Denver Broncos to really push our messaging. Von Miller was great until he got traded to the LA Rams. And then now he's in Buffalo. And then law enforcement, we did Google ads. We also did Facebook ads, but they shut them down. And we created an election integrity website. And then we did our own outreach campaign. And let's see if this works. It's always a risk. It's gonna work. Guys, no. Hold on. All right, now I've got to change my.
If you want, you can drop the link of the video in the chat and I can play it from our end here.
Yeah, that would be much easier. Why don't I do that?
Also, for the viewers, if you have any questions, our email is in the description. Please email us and we will ask them for you. Our live stream is not working. Our live chat is not working, unfortunately.
All right, so that was pretty much all I wanted to say. I'm happy to take questions, and there is the video if you want to show it. Because it's YouTube, you will have to suffer through an ad, I'm sure, before it will come up. If you're talking to me, I can't hear you. While you're doing this, I'll just mention we have a, you should tell me when you're ready. We have a Secretary of State. Her name is Jenna Griswold. She's been Secretary for the last almost 4 years. She's up for re-election. The previous Secretary of State was a guy named Wayne Williams. Jenna beat Wayne in the 2018 election. So, Democrat, Republican. And so they did this ad together to show that they both believe that Colorado elections are fair and accurate.
Hi, I'm Democratic Secretary of State Jenna Griswold.
And I'm Wayne Williams, a Republican and former Secretary of State. One thing we both know is that Colorado's elections are safe and secure.
That's right, Wayne. But voters should be alert to election disinformation.
Election disinformation is designed to look real, so always use trusted sources.
Together, we can combat election disinformation. To get the facts about election security, visit govotecolorado.gov. Let's go vote, Colorado.
All right, there you go. That was the ad campaign that we did that I think was very successful. There were some people that were annoyed that Secretary Griswold was on it. They felt like it was sort of promotion, but for the most part, it got a lot of very good feedback. It was actually a series of ads. That was just one. There was 3 or 4 other ones as well. All right, so I am available for questions.
Hi, Judd. I'm Ben Blankenship. I'm one of the co-organizers. So thank you. That was a really informative discussion, informative talk. I think that one of the big questions that we might have and other people that are watching might have is what kind of similarities and differences might you expect in other states? So people who are watching this that are in Virginia, would you expect things to be pretty similar? What things would you expect would be unique to Colorado?
Yeah, great question. So the data that I've seen across different kinds of research, mine, and then the SPAE, which is the SPAE survey that MIT puts out every year after a major election, all of those seemingly indicate a trend where people feel pretty good about their local elections, their state elections, but they feel far less confident about the way other people are doing their elections. And interestingly, I'll just cite an example for you. I know that Georgia did something like this. Georgian voters, they think that their election was fantastic. Every other state thinks that Georgia elections were awful. So there's really this weird dynamic that seems to be playing out of not feeling universal confidence for the way elections are conducted, but specific confidence for your elections. I have a thought about that. So I believe that we in the United States do our elections so very differently across jurisdictions. Here I am in a mail ballot state. You guys are not a mail ballot state. Because of that, it's really hard to have an understanding of what's happening in those other states. And then if you become aware of the fact that other states are doing it very differently, and that there are sort of various flavors of the version that other states are using, you sort of turn that off and you just sort of say to yourself, it's us and them. Them is everybody else. And because of that, it really colors your way of understanding how elections are happening around the country. And so, for instance, I think that is pretty damaging for U.S. elections and creates this dynamic. But it's also pretty clear that states do have a lot of leeway to do elections as they so choose. And for that reason, I think it's something we have to live with and work around.
So we're still waiting for questions coming from the online folks. So I'll just follow up with that. So like you mentioned, part of the problem, it seems, with distrust is that there's so many different systems, kind of it's hard to keep track. Is there anything that you can see from your perspective that might be helpful for kind of making it less mystic? Like, for instance, I was thinking if you were to show a map and show all the states that have very similar election laws to Colorado and say, these states have very similar laws to us. If you trust us, by extension, maybe you can trust them. Would something like that, do you think, be helpful?
Yeah, maybe. So in Colorado's case, that would be sort of Washington, Oregon, Utah, California, Hawaii, Montana, Arizona. We all sort of, interestingly, Iowa. We all sort of run them the same way. Vermont is a recent adoptee of vote by mail. So yeah, if you sort of targeted in on those, you might be able to sort of overcome these differences. I have, since we're sort of gathering up topics, I will give you a 30-second version of a lecture I give in my election law class. So I teach classes at the University of Minnesota at the Humphrey Institute, online classes for elections administration. So if any of you or your students are interested in that, you can just do a search for HHH, which is the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute, and the CEA program, Certificate in Elections Administration. You can find out all about it. Anyway, so a little lecture that I give is about the history of US elections and where the federal government has sort of intruded into state elections. And there's really only 5 times in the history of 230 years of US democracy. And the first one was in 1965, and that was the Voting Rights Act. So we went 150 plus years before we ever had the first time in which the federal government really got involved. And then from there, it was like another 25 years before there was another big law. The Voting Rights Act was mostly about voter registration, and there was all these limitations on who could register to vote and under what circumstances. There were some other pieces to it, but largely it was about voter registration. And then it was changed over time. But subsequent to that, we had 2 UOCAVA laws. So these are for military and overseas voters. Again, largely about voter registration and then about ballot distribution. And then the National Voter Registration Act, which was passed in 1993, became law in 1994. Many people call it the Motor Voter Law. And that was all about voter registration, requiring DMVs to offer an opportunity to register to vote, which is required in Virginia. And then, as well as in 44 states. And then in the most recent piece of legislation was the Help America Vote Act, which was in 2002, 2003. And it came as a consequence of the Florida issues in the 2000 election. None of those were about voting. They were all about voter registration or about certifying equipment and about the use of equipment and who was the chief election official. None of them were about voting. And so what's happened over time is every jurisdiction has kind of gone their own way in voting. And it's made, we're all kind of all over the place. And there are a number of bills that are basically Amy Klobuchar's bills. Klobuchar is senator from Minnesota. She's really the person that runs every major voting bill in the US Senate. And She has a number of bills that are up, which are all about voting. And so if any of those actually passed, that would be a revolution in American elections, because it would force every jurisdiction to basically go back to the starting line and all get back to the same way of doing elections, within some parameters. We'd all basically have to do about the same. So that's if you're interested in that, and you're interested in this concern that I have about we all do it differently. One way to sort of overcome that would be through the adoption of one of these important pieces of legislation that Klobuchar has been pushing. That was more than 30 seconds. My apologies.
Awesome. It was still much appreciated. So we have a question from the audience. It says, why do you think that confidence in elections/voting increased when using in mail-in ballots as opposed to in person?
Oh, well, I don't think it really had anything to do with mail ballots. I think it was about who was responding, because the people that were saying, I love mail ballots, and we think that they're, fair. I think those are the people that tend to be the people that use mail ballots, so it was about who was responding in the two categories. Those people who were responding, who did vote in person, which for us is a very small group of people, they seemed to really think that there was a problem with mail ballots. And then the people that voted their mail ballot all thought, vote in person if you want to, but my mail ballot is perfectly fine. And so I didn't actually, there was a number of slides about that, which I didn't bring up, but those are some issues we saw across the survey.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification.
Mhm.
So we have another question comes from someone watching online. They said, from your statistics, conservatives are the ones who did not have the most trust in elections. Many conservatives also have a similar distrust of the government. Many of the programs you mentioned are from the government. So how would you reach those people?
It's really hard. I think that's the $1 million question. In fact, I think you could probably add a couple of zeros to that. There are a lot of people that are trying to tap into that group to try to figure out how to express or communicate ideas to them, but also how to change their philosophies about government or the various policies that you're describing. I don't know. I mean, the answer is it's really difficult. And this, again, probably unsurprising to those of you that have been paying attention, but social media has exacerbated this problem. And what's happened is we've exacerbated this problem. I always do that. By putting people in camps, where they only really talk to themselves. And so your ability to tap into them is much more difficult. In the old days, just as an old person now, a new thing for me, but I'm getting used to it. Walter Cronkite talked to everybody. Everybody watched the news, and we all got the same thing from Walter or from one of the other major networks. And you had sort of a general understanding of the issues of the day, and that is simply not the case anymore. Now, if you really want to be at the extreme, you can find the extreme in your little corner of the internet and never have to interact with the rest of the world. And so tapping those people, touching those people is really, really difficult. And again, that's where a lot of money is being spent, a lot of resources and time is being dedicated.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Just a quick follow-up on that. I think you said for both of your studies, they were of registered voters. Have you doing a survey of numbers?
Yeah, the actual they were for both they were both for registered voters. I don't actually know the percentage of those who voted for the quantitative, but 92 out of 93 of the qualitative were voters, so registered and voters. Interestingly, when you do a survey and you ask people, hey, answer some questions about voting, you get a hang up if you didn't vote. So the person that answers the phone and then you ask them questions is not real interested in talking about an experience they didn't have. And so it makes it really difficult to tap into that audience of people who are not your voters. That is, so if I was going to direct you, I would direct you to the SPAE survey, because Charles Stewart, who's the professor at MIT who runs that, he has really over time sort of perfected this effort to tap into that non-voter group and to better understand how those people are perceiving these same issues across a whole myriad of different ideas. And in doing so has really sort of become the way that we understand non-voters. But we didn't try to do that in our survey. We didn't have that much money.
Bobby has a question.
Bobby has a question. Outstanding.
Judd, can you just talk a little bit about, do you have knowledge about Virginia elections? I know that we talked a little bit before tonight about Virginia's efforts in order to communicate trustworthiness of the elections. So can you talk a little bit about Virginia's efforts, and then any insights that you have about Virginia elections themselves that might be different than Colorado? Obviously, we're not a mail-in ballot state, but other insights that you know from our state.
Can do. So one of the interesting things about Virginia, which I'll give Virginia a lot of credit for, is that they've been very proactive. You've been very proactive in messaging on mis and disinformation, basically to try to combat mis and disinformation. There's sort of multiple attitudes generally across the country about how to deal with mis and disinformation in elections. There are the ostrich perspective of put your head in the sand, hope it goes away. There are a lot of states doing that. And some of that is because they themselves are not sort of living the experience of mis and disinformation about their elections. So I'll just pick on somebody, but let's say an Idaho or a Wyoming or Oklahoma, states where Donald Trump won by a very large percentage. People generally feel pretty good about what happened in their states. And so the group of voters who were most affected by the outcome of the election are okay with what happened in that state and aren't expressing their frustrations as loudly as it's happening in, say, Virginia and in Colorado and some other states. So, but then there are the states that are trying to do some things on the edges, maybe being proactive in speaking to groups, local elections officials being out there, talking to schools and so forth. That's sort of category number 2. And then there's category number 3, Colorado, Virginia, North Carolina, solidly in this category, Ohio, solidly in this category, where we're expending money and doing significant outreach to try to find people that are beyond those that are in the audience. And so Virginia has done some really interesting stuff. In fact, if I had thought about it, I would have looked at YouTube up, but there is a very good series of I don't want to call them advertisements, but I guess they are. They're little advertisements where elections officials in Virginia talk about their work and talk about, why they do it, what they do, why they know it's good, why, their community should believe in it. And it is, I find it emotional to watch it. Seriously, the first time I watched it, I was struck by it because it very much taps into the way I feel about elections. And I thought it was incredibly effective. And that was the Virginia version of trying to address that mis and disinformation. Far less, we're sort of in the let's convince you perspective, right? That's what Colorado is trying to do. Virginia is in the let me tell you about the people that do this work and let them do the convincing for us. They're being they're creating this sort of secondary persuasion. And I felt like it was incredibly persuasive ad or series of ads. As you say, Virginia is much more of an in-person early voting state, which means we are both, in a way, we're both sort of we're non-in-person on election day, but your in-person or your non-in-person in election day is early voting, and ours is mail ballot. So we consider if you think about it, they're both different ways to get ballots to people. My way is to put it in an envelope and send it. Your way is to have the person stand in front of you and you slide it across the counter. So there's two distribution ways. They're just different. And in both circumstances, the ballot gets to the voter and the voter can cast that ballot. We don't have a voter registration deadline. We're a same day registration state. In fact, that's the growing universe of voters or states in the country, where I think we're up to 18 states in the country, maybe even more than that are same day registration. I hope to welcome Virginia to that club someday, because same day there is no reason why there should be a voter registration cutoff. That is so 1980. And I hope that you guys will eventually make it into, and it's just technology. I mean, if you have technology, you can overcome the problems that same day registration causes.
Judd, I just wanted to thank you so much for being with us this evening for us, or the afternoon for you.
Yeah.
It's been such a pleasure for you to share your insights and tell us a little bit about election trust in Colorado and its application to Virginia. So thank you so much for being with us again. And thank you so much, our live stream viewers. This is recorded, and so you can see it on our website, valleyvotesproject.com. Thank you so much, Judd.
Thanks, everybody. See ya.
One more thing. We have to announce our winner of the Instagram sharing, which is Elizabeth Gaver, who shared the event and is our winner. So thank you so much. Congratulations, Elizabeth.
You mean I could have shared the event? I could have won?
Yeah, on Instagram.
I blew it.
All right. Thank you so much, Judd. We really appreciate your time and energy and all that you do. Thank you so much for being with us.